Throughout history, there have been people who have committed some of the most heinous crimes fathomable. For those crimes, they have been convicted and sentenced to death. Welcome to Death Row Executions, where we take a look into the lives of society's worst offenders. And now, your host, Air.
Frank Joseph Coppola, not to be confused with famous Italian-American crime boss Frank Coppola, was born on February 25, 1944 in Portsmouth, Virginia, to parents Vincent Anthony and Mary Rose Coppola. Growing up in a lower-middle-class neighborhood and the youngest of 3 children, Frank lived a decent life in his religious household. He spent many years as an altar boy at the St. Paul's Catholic Church. The family did experience hard times, especially in 1954 when Frank was 10 because his sister had passed away from kidney failure. To top it off, a few years later in 1957, Frank's father Vincent passed away. Mary Rose was now a widow, taking care of 2 children on her own. Frank, just like his father who was a bookkeeper, shared a love for books and sports. Frank did well in school academically and excelled in basketball. He was over 6 feet tall and was the leading rebounder on his high school basketball team. He was so good that he was voted most outstanding player on his basketball team. Frank's basketball coach, Ernest Howard, said, "Frank was a real strong boy and had great potential as an athlete. Despite doing well with his schoolwork and his basketball, Frank became a troublemaker and started getting into a lot of fights." Despite his disciplinary marks, colleges noticed his potential, and Frank ended up earning a basketball scholarship to Old Dominion University. Frank graduated from St. Paul's Catholic High School in 1963 and joined Old Dominion University that same year in fall, but he was later kicked out of college in 1964 for disciplinary reasons. One of his friends said, "What gets Frankie in trouble is his temper. He would have made a great pro athlete if it weren't for his temper." A year after being kicked out of college, Frank joined the Portsmouth Police Department. That same year, on June 2, 1965, Frank married Alice Dupree in South Mills, North Carolina, and they had 2 sons together, Frank Jr. and Vincent Anthony, who was named after his father. Despite growing up in a religious home and his family thinking he was an honest young man, he wasn't able to escape his bad behavior and dishonest actions. Frank began falsifying statements and lying while on duty. Just a year after joining the force in 1966, Frank was dismissed from the Portsmouth Police Department for submitting a false statement to a police chief and for failing to report an assault on a prisoner. Frank, not wanting to be fired, appealed his dismissal, and he won his case. With his win, the police department dismissed his dismissal to a 90-day suspension without pay. After his suspension was over, he was back patrolling the streets, but less than a year later, in April of 1967, Frank was suspended yet again for insubordination to a superior police officer. Frank's partner, Sergeant Leo Gillerlane, said this about Frank. "He was a right tough boy. You could control him, but sometimes he didn't know when to stop. He could be a little rough." Frank's suspension was at most 1 month. He was patrolling again in May, and by June, he got in trouble again for failing to perform duties correctly on 3 separate occasions. He was given multiple chances to correct his behavior and was unable to do it, so the police department recommended that Frank be dismissed from his duties as an officer. Before officially being fired, Frank knew he would not win an appeal, so he immediately submitted his resignation and quit his career in law enforcement. He chose not to reach out to other police departments for work, though, and instead, he attempted to work a regular civilian life. Instead of his fellow officers remembering him for good things and good actions, they remembered him for the opposite. Many other officers witnessed Frank doing odd things. On occasion, he would catch spiders off the walls in the jail, and he would eat them. He would also swallow small objects, and even though he was unsuccessful, he had even tried swallowing a tiny dead bird. Frank's first job after working as an officer was working as a finance worker. The job was not working out for him, so he went into business with an associate and became the co-owner of a drive-in restaurant. Frank left that job, and he then started working as a salesman for Go Sport Motor Sales. Frank worked for Go Sport Motor Sales for 2 years and worked his way up to a sales manager before he decided to leave that job as well to manage a hot dog stand instead. He eventually went broke for giving away too much free food to people who were not able to afford the food he was selling. Frank decided that work was no longer for him, and he turned to a life of crime. In 1971, Frank and his friend Joseph Miltier were busted for burglary, and they were sent to prison. Frank was released 2 years later in 1973 and started selling cars again. Frank's wife Alice divorced him while he was in prison in 1972. Alice was able to get full custody of her sons, and she married a new man by the name of Robert Bridges. In 1974, Frank decided to start another business in reconditioning cars. While he was managing his new business, he met and married a woman named Karen Lewis Evans. The following year, in 1975, Frank got into a car accident that left him with a lot of back pain. Along with his health declining a bit, so did his marriage. Frank and Karen began struggling financially because Frank was not able to go back to work. They were able to survive off of borrowing money from family and friends for a short while, though. Frank eventually decided that he would get money the easy way and take it from someone else. He found out where rich used car dealer Payton Hatchell lived and made his way to his home in Newport News, Virginia in spring of 1978. Once at his home, Frank pretended to be a priest and knocked on Payton's door. Payton answered and was met by Frank, who was requesting to talk to Payton inside of his home. Payton did not allow Frank entrance to his home, so Frank decided to leave empty-handed. Not wanting to give up on stealing from Payton, Frank enlisted the help from his former accomplice, Joseph Miltier, to help him. The men then decided to bring their significant others along with them to rob Payton. On April 22, 1978, Frank, his wife Karen, Joseph, and his girlfriend Donna Mills made their way to Newport News, Virginia, with the hopes of being able to successfully rob Payton. When they knocked on the door, Payton's wife Muriel answered. Donna Mills was holding a bouquet of roses, and hidden in the roses was a gun. Donna, Joseph, and Frank forced themselves inside of the home, while Karen stayed in the getaway car outside. Back inside of the house, poor Muriel was physically assaulted multiple times in the head, all while Frank continued to ask her where she and Payton kept all of their money. While the attack was happening, Payton came home and immediately saw what they were doing to his wife Muriel. Not being able to save Muriel or help himself, Payton then started to get assaulted by the gang. Finally, Frank, Karen, Joseph, and Donna were able to get their hands on 3 expensive rings and $3,000 in cash. Satisfied with the loot, they left the home, leaving an injured Muriel and Payton in the house by themselves to suffer from their wounds. When paramedics arrived at the scene, they discovered that it was too late to save Muriel. Because of her injuries, she was having issues with her breathing. She threw up, but the vomit stayed lodged in her throat, and she eventually died of a brain hemorrhage. As for Payton, although he did survive his injuries, he had to stay in the hospital for 3 weeks. He suffered a fracture in his skull, and because of how severe the skull fracture was, he was required to have a permanent steel plate underneath his forehead skin. Eventually, Frank and his accomplices were captured and held in jail to await their trials. While locked up, and when trial began, Frank continued to express that he was innocent of committing any murder. His accomplice Donna turned on Frank during trial by accepting a deal in order to testify against him. Donna told the jury that Frank assaulted and killed Muriel. Prosecutors then told the jury that on top of the killing and witness testimony, Frank's fingerprints were found on Muriel's car. Joseph was sentenced to 3 life sentences. Donna, who testified against Frank to get a lighter sentence, got her sentence reduced to life and 117 years in prison. Karen was sentenced to 55 years in prison for being an accessory, even though she stayed in the car during the murder. As for Frank, on September 26, 1978, he was found guilty and was sentenced to death by method of electrocution. Typically, after a criminal is sentenced to death, there are automatic appeals, but Frank dropped all of his appeals and volunteered to have his sentence carried out despite claiming he was innocent. After Frank's sentence, he was initially sent to the prison at Mecklenburg, but on August 10, 1982, his electrocution execution was scheduled, and he was transferred to a prison in Richmond. The transfer came 2 to 3 weeks before his execution. When it was nearing August 10th, Frank had a last meal of an egg and cheese sandwich. He refused visits by priests, lawyers, friends, family, and reporters. Frank was happy that his execution was held during summer because his 2 sons would be on summer vacation, and he thought that dying during the summer would free them from being exposed to ridicule by schoolmates. Wanting to hurry and get his execution done and over with, Frank was quoted saying, "I want to rescue any semblance of dignity I have left." When it was time for Frank's execution, it did not go the way the prison had planned for it to go, so it was considered a botched execution. Frank was hit with jolts of electricity that lasted for 55 seconds, but it did not complete the job. The executioner then went for another round of 55-second jolts, but this time, parts of Frank's body, like his head and legs, caught on fire. The flames were put out, and once the smoke was cleared, Frank was pronounced dead. Thank you all for watching another episode of Death Row Executions. If you enjoyed this video, please like, comment, share, and subscribe.